Intelligence².com.
My name is Nader Musabizadeh. I'm the Chief Executive of Oxford Analytica. And let me also add my words of welcome to all of you here for what we hope will be a very lively and interesting exchange on 9/11, 10 years on, the world we made. Oxford Analytica is a global analysis and advisory firm, and our principal responsibility is to advise our clients on how events in the macro context, be they political, economic, legal, or regulatory, affect their commercial, political, and institutional interests. Tonight, what we're going to do for you is to interpret the decade since 9/11, talk about how it has helped shift and accelerated certain shifts in the global power balance, how it's affected the major power centers, be they Moscow, China, the United States, Britain, and the Middle East, and what that will mean for the decade to come. To begin this evening's discussion, we are very privileged to ask David Miliband to start us off. David, as all of you know, is the former UK Foreign Secretary from 2007 to 2010, is currently the MP for South Shields, and we are very privileged that David has decided to pursue a number of his international interests through an affiliation with Oxford Analytica as a senior global advisor. David will start us off by setting the broader context for this very complex and volatile world, a world in which power has shifted immensely, where China, of course, is a rising power, and we will talk about that with Rana Mitter, but also a world where we have seen power fragment in lots of ways, power, capital, and ideas, all fragmenting in a way that I think of as an archipelago world. David, please.
Thank you very much, Nader. Thank you very much, Nader, and thank you to all of you for giving up time to come and have I think, the first discussion about the post-9/11 world. A summary of the first discussion at the time of the 10th anniversary of the terrible events of 9/11. A summary of what I'm going to say is as follows, that this has been the most traumatic decade for the West since the 1930s, that the reasons are to do with security, to do with economics, they're reasons that are moral as well as practical, and that to restore confidence and stability of any kind is going to be immensely challenging over the decade ahead. I think of the last decade as really a decade of disorder, a decade of disorientation. And 9/11 was the trigger for that decade of disorder, but it's not the only factor. Someone famously said that 9/11 sent the kaleidoscope into flux, and the kaleidoscope hasn't settled, not just because it's taken 10 years to chase down bin Laden, but because the decade since 9/11 has seen Iraq and all of its components. It's also seen the worst global financial crisis in 80 years. It's seen a remarkable shift in the economic balance of power that Nader referred to. So this is about more than 9/11, but 9/11 was the start of it. And if you try and think back through history, how do you get order in the international system? If this has been a decade of disorder, how previously was order established? There are really three ways in which order has been established in the international system over the last few hundred years. One is through a dominant power, a hegemonic power, an empire. The second is through the balance of power. And the third is through the sharing of sovereignty. It's happened most obviously within the European Union over the last 40 or 50 years. Those are really the only three ways in which order has been established. And if you think about the post-Second World War period, you actually had all three going on. You had both a dominant power, the United States, you had a balance of power with the Soviet Union, and you had the growth of shared sovereignty. Now, what's happened in the last decade is that America has been on the back foot, fiscally and economically, but also in security terms. The balance of power hasn't existed because the rising powers are precisely that, rising. They're not risen, they're rising powers. And the place where shared sovereignty has been tried in the European Union, it's struggling, as we can see now in Greece, it's struggling to even hold the ring within its borders, never mind be a global presence. So in those circumstances, perhaps it's not surprising that we've had a decade of disorder or a decade of disorientation. And what you'll get from the specialists who are following me is some detail. And what I want to try and sketch for you is Why has this decade of disorder come about? And there are 5 reasons I want you to think about that I think make this period different. The first is it's been an asymmetric decade. What do I mean by that? I mean by that a place of ungoverned space, the badlands of the Afghan-Pakistan border, could become the place to threaten the most governed and ordered societies in the world. I mean, it's asymmetric, not just because roadside bombs can push back armies, but because a non-governmental organization, Al-Qaeda, could send the most powerful country in the world into convulsions. It's also been an asymmetric decade in business. Daniel Pink's got this book called Drive, and he starts by saying, if you'd asked 100 economists 15 years ago, which company is going to dominate the world encyclopedia business? Is it going to be the world's biggest company, Microsoft, that's going to pay people to write articles and produce the world's best and brightest encyclopedia? Or is it going to be a company that doesn't yet exist, made up of volunteers who are going to make their suggestions onto a global website, and it's called Wikipedia? Those 100 economists would all have said, look, Microsoft is bound to win this battle. It hasn't. Microsoft's encyclopedia business has gone out of business, and Wikipedia is dominating that market. So it's been an asymmetric decade, point 1. Point 2, Al-Qaeda has represented what I call an enforced detour from the drive to build up the governing institutions for a 21st century interdependent world. It's been a detour fiscally, financially, in terms of blood and treasure, but it's also been a detour because it's sapped so much attention. Why do I say enforced detour? Because I think that we had no choice but to confront what Al-Qaeda was and is. So it's been an enforced detour. But I think it's very important. One of the things I disagreed with about the notion of a war on terror, I mean, one problem with it was it grouped all terrorist groups under the Al-Qaeda banner, but it also suggested that the form of terrorism we were facing was the same as Baader-Meinhof or the Red Brigades or the IRA. And actually, I think Al-Qaeda is a different global phenomenon, was and is a different global phenomenon. I think that the Taliban did need to be taken out of Kabul because the space that they were guaranteeing for Al-Qaeda was very dangerous. But some very serious mistakes were made. The first was that the vanquished, who were willing to live within the political system, those remnants of the Taliban, who saw themselves as politicians, not militants, were kept out of the Bonn Conference in 2002. And everything we know about history tells you that if the vanquished are kept out, it's a recipe for trouble. Funnily enough, Condoleezza Rice, of all people, said to me, who was integrally involved with the Bonn Conference, she said, on reflection, that the attempt, it was worse than ironic that Afghanistan, one of the most decentralized countries in the world, had one of the most centralized political systems imposed on it, with executive authority vested in Kabul, but Afghanistan is a country of 40,000 villages and valleys. And tragically, when the Taliban were driven into Kandahar and offered to sue for peace, they were actually driven out into Pakistan where they regrouped. So mistakes have been made in the political domain rather than the military domain, something I want to come back to. So second point, there's been an enforced detour for the West. Third point, it's been a decade of 2 halves. We've been concerned with security. The rest of the world has been getting much richer. It's, in 10 years ago, India and China represented 4% of global trade. Today it's 12%. 63% of economic growth in the last 10 years has come from emerging economies. There are 50 to 70 million new members of the middle class in Asia coming through every year at the moment. Fundamental shift in the economic balance of power. There's $1 trillion worth of foreign exchange reserves in the Gulf alone. So, third reason there's a sense of disorder is that the economic template has shifted. Fourth reason, and I think it's worth discussing this, it's a difficult point to make, one has to make it carefully. America is a reluctant empire. If you go back to Bill Clinton's last State of the Union message in 2000, he said, look, this has been the best decade in American history. We've done amazing things. We're not threatened abroad. And now our task is to focus at home. George Bush ran for election in 2000. Condi Rice wrote a piece saying, America will not be the world's policeman. Barack Obama, in his first inaugural address, said, the nation building I want to do is at home. He repeated that in his speech last week about Afghanistan. And that's a fourth reason why it's been a decade of disorder, which I think we should come back to and try and work our way through. And the fifth reason is there's a fundamental divide in the world among politicians and academics about whether an interdependent world needs new rules and institutions that embrace new principles of shared sovereignty for their governance. The rules of 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia, that have governed international law for the last 350 years, assert the primacy and sovereignty of the nation-state. And I am a very strong believer in the political legitimacy, the unique political legitimacy of the nation-state. But I also believe that you can't run an interdependent world on the basis that there's unfettered sovereignty of nation-states. If you do that, carbon emissions go out of control, human rights get abused, and the international system is ungoverned and undergoverned. And that's what you've got at the moment. So those are 5 reasons why I think this has been a decade of disorder. And I was trying to think, what's the right sort of metaphor to get this? And then I was in Washington, and Madeleine Albright, who was Secretary of State in the 90s, I spoke to her, and she came up with, I think, a really good point. She said, look, in the Cold War era, foreign policy was like steering a ship along the Panama Canal. You kept your eyes straight, and you just tried not to bump against the sides. In the 1990s, foreign policy was like being in the English Channel. You had water all around you, but you could see the land on each side, 26 miles. In the modern world, we're out on the high seas, and no one can see the landmass. And that's, I think, a good summary of how it feels for a lot of politicians today. What do we do about it? I just want to leave you with 4 quick reflections. The first speaks to something that Richard Holbrooke, the former peacemaker in the Balkans, remarkable peacemaker, and a remarkable advocate for a change in Afghanistan and Pakistan. One of the things he said to me before he died was that one of the terrible legacies of the last 10 years was what he called the militarization of diplomacy. It's a very powerful phrase if you think about it. And what he was essentially saying was that the military calculus had become preeminent in too much thinking that should be the realm of politics and diplomacy. And in fact, we need the opposite, given the threats that we face. Even though the threats are military, a lot of the answers to them are going to have to be political. Second point, when we talk about a balance of power in the future, we're going to have to talk about people, not just states. And you can see that in the Middle East at the moment. That deals between Western leaders and leaders in the Arab world will only stick if they have the consent of the people. And the coalitions of the future aren't just going to be between states, they're going to have to include people, reflecting this extraordinary shift in the balance of power between organizations, public and private, and the people. And the fact that the current President Assad's father could slaughter 20,000 people and no one really know about it, but now you can watch on your TV or on your computer from someone's mobile phone what the current President Assad's forces are doing in Syria tells you a lot about how power has shifted. The fact that Robert Mugabe's attempts to rig the election in Zimbabwe were overcome by people taking pictures of the results on each of 9,000 polling stations around Zimbabwe and sending them to a special server in South Africa tells you about the shift in power between organizations and individuals. So the second thing is coalitions of consent are going to have to be about people as well as states. Third point, I haven't got time to talk about it, for the first time in 200 years, resource scarcity rather than resource plenty defines our age. It's a really big thing. Nada will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the figure is the rise in non-oil commodity prices in the last 10 years has been as big as the rise in non-oil commodity prices in the Second World War. In other words, we're in the equivalent of a war situation when it comes to non-oil commodity prices, and you know what's happened to the price of oil. Fourth and final point, the West is going to have to rediscover the joys of multilateralism. It's a really tough point, this. And I foresee time now where there's a backlash against globalization and there'll be a backlash against international institutions. But I believe it's actually going to come back because the folly of trying to run the modern world just according to the interests of independent nation states and not about shared interests, I think is going to come up into big problems. I think I've used up my time, so I just want to finish on the following point, which troubles me and interests me. In 1908, a man called Norman Angell wrote a book called The Great Illusion. And he set out in the first paragraph of that book to take on what he said was the myth of the last 50 years, writing in 1908. And the myth was that military expansionism could guarantee economic security. He wanted to dismember that myth. His argument was economic expansion can guarantee your military security. In other words, he inverted it. Now, it turned out he was tragically wrong 6 years later with the First World War. The First World War proved him wrong. Why was he wrong? Because the truth is, economics without politics is as dangerous as politics without economics. And the politics was completely missing from his analysis. And I think that if we're going to take any lessons from the Arab Spring, the first should be that the primacy of politics is something that speaks to every person in every part of the world. And if we take that seriously, we've got a chance of building a more humane and fairer world in the future. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you, David, very much. In my haste to get us going and my impatience to hear David's observations, I forgot a couple of housekeeping matters. One is that we're very much hoping to have this be a conversation both amongst panelists as well as with this audience. We are going to go region by region to explore the Middle East, to explore the issues of counterterrorism, to explore China's role and China's perspective in all this. And the empty chair, I should say, is for our senior Russia analyst who's stuck in traffic and hopefully will make it. If not, I'll talk a bit about Africa at the end. I think what we've heard from David is really some key observations about how this world of disorder is affecting, or certainly how it looks to people in the West. And what I suppose I'd like to ask you about, David, just now is clearly what we have to understand in the West, or those of us here with a Western background, is to much of the rest of the world, to China, India, Brazil, and many other countries, Indonesia and others, this, of course, is a world of opportunity, not a world of disorder. And in fact, much of the order that we considered stable and comfortable and in our interest was not in theirs, and they certainly didn't see it as such. How do we marry their interest in a new kind of order that addresses and reflects their interests with the kind of global governance that you talk very powerfully about as being necessary to making sure that we don't have a world that can't govern and certainly can't manage the issues that remain global, whether they be climate change or global financial flows?
Well, I think that's really powerful. I mean, in a longer exposition, I'd have said it's been a traumatic decade for the West. It's been one of the best decades in the last 80 years for the rest. And it's important to say that. Tens of millions of people around the world have benefited in the last decade, not just materially, more free than they were in some ways, although the tide of democratic reform sort of stopped the Middle East until recently. I think that for those who've thrown off the shackles of international control and domination, telling them that there are some new rules that we want to invent for the global order is a very tough sell. And it's a tough sell in America as well as in China, because the two countries that in the end are most leery of a climate change regime are America and China. We should remember that anyone who thinks a G2 world, group of two world, is going to be a world that is necessarily ordered in a way that we would like needs to, I think quite carefully about it. I think that the most dangerous charge we face is the charge of hypocrisy. And that's the charge that undermines a lot of attempts to turn things around. I think that's true on climate most obviously. It's also true in the Middle East in some ways. And we've got to be careful it doesn't become true in South Asia.
Thank you. I think before we go on to the next speaker, if there's someone who's burning with a question for David, we're going to have a Q&A session at the end. But anyone with a burning question right now for David, we're very happy to go out into the room. There are roving mics. There's a gentleman at the back. Maybe we could start with you. You know what? We'd prefer questions at the beginning. If we have lots of time at the end, we'll leave it to comments. Okay, why don't we move on? We have in the question of the Arab Spring that you mentioned, clearly one of the most important shifts that are going on. To help understand what's been going on in the Middle East, we will turn to Michael Crawford, who joined Oxford Analytica as a senior global advisor also this year, after a very distinguished 30-year career with the British government on national security and diplomatic issues, with postings in most of the capitals that have driven a lot of the change in the Middle East, as well as here in London. Michael, before starting you off, there's a line from Lenin, and I know you're an avid reader of his works. There's a line from Lenin that I'd like to quote, and I use often when I talk about this momentous series of shifts, which is that sometimes decades pass and nothing happens, and then sometimes weeks pass and decades happen. It feels very much like after 40 years of stagnation or more in the Middle East, something like decades passed in a matter of weeks and are still ongoing. With that thought, would love to hear your observations on what we're seeing and what it will lead to.
Well, thank you very much. It's tough business following a former foreign secretary in full intellectual flight. What I would like to do is to just pick up the point he made at the end about the role of politics and also, of course, about the Arab Spring. And the area that I want to cover this evening is that between Morocco and Pakistan. Now, 9/11 was the day that the world froze in shock. I think all of us here will remember that. And for several countries, it ushered in a violent era, extremely violent era, which gave primacy to the use of military and paramilitary force. Today, the Middle East is again in shock, but confronted by a rather different phenomenon, and one which I think actually has a greater capacity for change even than 9/11. It is driven not by a small vanguard of extremists committed to a visionary ideology and nihilistic methods, but by the man and the woman on the street seeking political, social, and economic justice. And it is the regimes that are initiating the violence. This revolt of the citizen, supported by new social networking and other media, may be the harbinger of a different world, and one which I think dictators across the planet should be studying rather carefully. So how do we go from 9/11 to the Arab Spring? Well, I think 9/11 established the politics of threat. The US neocons who decided to invade Iraq believed it would help to break down, destroy entrenched patterns of power across the Middle East. But actually, this was it was a counterproductive move. You have regimes which, if anything, became more repressive and more autocratic, particularly as they worried about the spillover from Iraq and Afghanistan. And they stalled on political reform. Talk, which I remember well, was all about US unilateralism, the Sunni-Shia divide, Al-Qaeda, terrorism, insurgency. This was a political environment consumed with threats. And rulers, I think, developed a narrow, defensive, and essentially tactical mindset. And they became so obsessed with one plot that they completely missed a much greater one, which actually did for some of them in short order. The Arab Spring did not come out of a clear blue sky. Dangerous demographics and social and economic mess was there for all to see. But governments had lost touch with their people, particularly with young people, and elites fell back on their core constituencies based around ethnic, sectarian, or other loyalties. And they didn't pay any attention to the interests of the wider population. In weak unitary states, regimes, governments gradually became weaker. Look at Lebanon, Somalia, Yemen, Iraq. Afghanistan, and Pakistan. Now everyone talks, of course, about the shift of power, transfer of power from west to east. But actually, in the part of the world that I'm talking about, the transfer of power was from governments to political non-state actors, David's referred to. Hamas, Hezbollah, Jaish al-Mahdi in Iraq, Taliban in Afghanistan, and, say, Lashkar-Taiba in Pakistan. Now, these organizations, which I call mezzanine rulers because they insert themselves between government and the people, deeply entrenched in local communities, using the label, the language of resistance, and used by some governments as deniable instruments for terrorism and insurgency. Now, these organizations, of course, benefited greatly from the loss of government control over the media, from new technologies, roadside bombs and other things, and, of course, from the failure of governments to address the interests of the ordinary citizen. But, of course, it's ironic because these mezzanine rulers ended up mirroring the governments that they tried to supplant or sideline. They ended up as unaccountable, as untransparent, as corrupt, and as brutal. Such, indeed, are the politics of communal identity. So we had the politics of threat, the politics of communal identity, and then running in parallel, the politics of empowerment. Now, of course, after 9/11, we were all obsessed with the issue of ungoverned space. Perhaps didn't devote quite as much attention to misgoverned countries. So we had these rulers who had entrenched themselves and consolidated their power. And I think we forget that about a year ago, hell of a long time ago, actually, in Nada's terms, in Lenin's terms, a year ago, we had, well, the neocons had faded from the scene. Obama had arrived. We had a massive economic crisis. We had what seemed like financial meltdown, and furthermore, general loss of confidence. And if you leave aside one or two legacy issues like North Korea or Iran or Afghanistan or Pakistan, actually no one was telling, no country, no regional body was telling governments around the Middle East how they ought to be running their political and economic systems. And this was a tremendous chance for them to address issues of governance. But regimes didn't, of course. But the man and the woman on the street did seize that opportunity, and they, of course, had been pretty impatient. So you ended up with the citizens looking for political, social, economic justice, trying to get rid of corruption, and introducing a new form of politics, I think. Now, whether in the end the politics of empowerment will supplant the politics of threat and the politics of communal identity, the months and the years ahead will show. But I do reflect that Mohamed Bouazizi, the unemployed Tunisian in an obscure Tunisian town who burnt himself to death on the 17th of December last year, he set in train a much greater process of change than anything Al-Qaeda has achieved through suicide bombing. Now, if you look at the Middle East or the rest of the world from the standpoint of two capitals, I'd like to do briefly, Riyadh and Tehran, at odds with each other, and of course in some ways defined by their relationship with the US. Now, the Saudi-US alliance, never the same since so many of the hijackers on 9/11 were actually Saudis. But then there was the problem of the Americans allegedly giving Iraq over to the Shia, and more recently, the Americans not supporting Mubarak in his hour of need. So an unreliable friend. Tehran, I think, would regard the Americans actually as a much more reliable enemy. They had been able to justify on the basis of that a covert nuclear weapons program and suppression of their own revolt. And I think the lesson that comes out of this is about self-reliance. And if I have one particular concern about that, it is that we will end up with a spread of covert nuclear weapons programs around the area. That, of course, it's a volatile area, and that heralds a good deal of danger, particularly if this capability, this technology, gets into the hands of terrorist groups. And we all watch the situation, the deteriorating situation in Pakistan with a good deal of trepidation. One concluding thought. David has spoken about ungoverned space. Actually, I think the ungoverned space that has proved to be just as important has been the ungoverned space of the internet. It's probably a reminder. It's time for me to finish. The ungoverned space of the internet, and I think how we exploit and manage the global commons, that is to say, all those phenomena, if you like, which are open to everybody in the international community, like cyberspace, how we deal with those will be as important as how we control destructive technologies for the creation of a better and less destructive world. This has, above all, been an extraordinary decade for technology and its impact on international affairs. But if we look forward to the next decade, I'd say we've seen nothing yet.
Michael, thank you very much. Sarah Michaels is going to join our panel. Absolutely. My words exactly. Michael, you addressed some of the key countries, and I'm sure this will come around in the Q&A session, that remain critical to this future, whether it's Saudi Arabia, whether it's Pakistan, whether it's Iran, certainly out of the kaleidoscope that was shifted after 9/11. What I'd like to do, unless there's a burning question for Michael in the audience, I would like, yes, there. Why don't we take that question and we'll move on afterwards, please.
That it was the disruptive force that was needed in order to set off the chain of events that have now caused the release of the Arab Spring?
Well, that's certainly, it may be a view. I don't, at the moment, see a direct connection between the invasion of Iraq and the Arab Spring. And in fact, Iraq is one country like a number of others that have had civil wars or near civil wars in the recent past, where the Arab Spring has not achieved much traction for very obvious reasons. Say Algeria is another one. But we don't know how the Iraq war will look 10, 20 years from now. And it may indeed be that the neocons turned out to be right in the longer term in that it did break up entrenched patterns of power, another dictator gone. And a belief perhaps fostered in the minds of Middle Easterners, these guys don't have to be there forever.
Thank you. Well, look, I think one of the things that's critical to the question that's asked at 9/11 is obviously the place of terrorism and counterterrorism and how that has shifted. I think it's the same phone that's ringing, which is quite remarkable, and how that has shifted really the politics and the security outlook for the West. It seems to me, Philip, that in a way the Arab Spring is a much, much better and more decisive answer to 9/11 even than the killing of Osama bin Laden. With your experience, Philip Mudd joined Oxford Analytica as a senior global advisor also in the last year after a long service with the US government in the region, in the Middle East, focusing on terrorism and counterterrorism issues in an analytical and diplomatic capability. Philip, give us your thoughts on this decade of terrorism and counterterrorism after clearly the most epical event of terrorism, and where you see this future threat pattern and the politics of threat that Michael talked about taking us.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. I arrived this morning from Saudi Arabia, so if I go face down, I'd appreciate the phone more. Noise is better. Like every good government bureaucracy, the White House doesn't like to say they have a lot of people on staff, so they get people like me on loan. I was at the White House at the Executive Office building on 911 on loan from CIA. And like every good bureaucrat, I was having coffee. And I remember coming back and seeing it's not a joke. Coming back and seeing the first plane going into the building and saying, that must be some fellow in a Cessna, a small aircraft, who made a mistake. And when the second aircraft went in, we were evacuated. And I went out on the streets that were chaos. It looked like a movie. I'll never forget it. There was no sense of anger, at least I didn't have any sense, and my friends didn't. There was a sense initially of chaos. And then as the day went on and I sat with friends of mine and watched buildings fall, a tremendous sense of sadness that so many children might grow up without ever seeing their parents again. But I thought this was a terrorist attack, which was a fundamental mistake. This was an attack by revolutionaries who wanted to sponsor a global movement of people who thought and acted as they did. I returned to CIA after actually going to Bonn, Germany as a CIA, I shouldn't talk about this, as a CIA person at the conference that put Karzai in government. And actually in Bonn, at a peace conference, had an Afghan, this is sort of tells you something, had an Afghan warlord walk up to me at the Bonn Peace Conference and ask, because he knew I was a CIA guy, for AK-47s. This was not a good start. That also is not a joke. But I remember going back to CIA, and in 2002, when I returned, the war obviously was at its height, or pardon me, the global campaign. Did you catch that? I made a mistake. The global campaign against terrorism, not the GWAT, not the global war. And I sat there, I was the briefer for then Director Tenet, CIA Director Tenet every night, and I briefed him every night on threat. We had something called the small group with the CIA director, government bureaucracy, 40 people in the room every night, and talked about things like threat, and then transitioned to talk about where we were in Afghanistan and where we were elsewhere around the world. The threat then was the revolutionary group of Al-Qaeda. What I talked to him about every night was technical information, things like phone intercepts and human source information that talked about what Al-Qaeda wanted to do in places like America or Europe or Indonesia or the Philippines. I didn't fully understand yet that we were talking about a revolution. And I noticed in 2003, especially with attacks in Riyadh in May of 2003, and then watching the attacks in Bali by the group Jemaah Islamiyah, and watching what was going on in Western Europe, and watching Al-Qaeda, like-minded people infiltrate the southern Philippines, that we had started with a revolutionary group that used the attacks of 9/11 to spark a revolution, and now we're transitioning to affiliated groups who wanted to carry the baton of revolution. These were not terrorist groups. These were groups that wanted to use terrorism to spark a global movement. So we transitioned from the tribal areas of Pakistan to the southern archipelago of the Philippines, into Saudi Arabia, and into Britain on 7/7, elsewhere in Western Europe, and into the Horn of Africa and North Africa. You think about the swath of geographic territory, remarkable. And I remember briefing threat continuing into 2003 at those nightly meetings with Director Tenet, and thinking that we did not understand what was going on, and I was concerned 2003, 04, 05 that we weren't winning. That we might be making gains against a group that we were slipping against the revolutionary movement. And I started realizing our real mission is to blunt a movement, not to defeat a group. And then starting in about 2000, I transitioned over to become the senior intelligence advisor to the FBI in 2005. Transitioning into 2008 or 2009, I started realizing that the third and final leg of this revolution was in place. that any group that wants to spark a revolution, especially a small group like Al-Qaeda, can never touch a revolutionary itself. It's got to inspire them. And that third group was like-mindeds. Kids who are not part of Al-Qaeda, who are not part of an affiliated group, but who instead themselves in a basement might look at videos of Abu Ghraib, which is one of the most damaging things I ever saw as an intelligence officer. They might look at videos of a dead baby in Palestine, and they might say, as they said in Northern Europe, in Southern Europe, and then in New York, in California, in Miami, in Seattle, in Portland, they said, I believe and I want to be part of the revolution. And then that revolution started to die. That's the second half I want to talk about, and I want to close in just a moment with what we need to think about the death of this revolution. Revolutions live not by acts of terrorism, but by selling an idea to a global audience. And that global audience started to realize that this idea included the mass murder of Muslim innocents. What happened in Riyadh in 2003 in May? Saudis died. I live in Riyadh 50% of the time, and my friends date the fight against this adversary not from September of 2001, but from May of 2003, because their own died. What happened, by the way, in the 90s in Algeria and Egypt? Counterinsurgency succeeded partly because of brutal security practices and partly because civilians said, I don't want this revolution. What happened in Iraq? We, from a Western optic, will say we had a surge of forces. That's a mistake. What happened is Iraqis said a bunch of foreigners came here. They went after the Americans. That's good. We don't like the Americans. And then they came after us. And we started saying, as Iraqis, we don't want this. We're dying. You guys, the Brits, the Americans, the foreigners are over there. What happened in Jordan? Abu Musab al-Zarqawi sent suicide bombers into wedding parties and lost his support overnight. Time and time again, this adversary overreaches in terms of trying to sell a revolution, and they kill too many innocents. Not American innocents, unfortunately, who don't count, not British innocents who don't count, but innocents in Algeria, in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, in Jordan, in Iraq, in Pakistan, in Indonesia, and elsewhere around the Islamic world. And if you look at blogs, and if you look at polling data, people now still hate the Americans. I'm proud to be among the hated. That is a joke. But increasingly, in contrast to where we were 9 or 10 years ago, that's separate from their views of bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. 9 years ago, those two issues were connected. Go after the Americans, we hate them. Now go after the Americans, but we don't support what you're doing because too many innocents died. So as this comet burns itself out, especially now that its spokesman is gone, how do we think about it? And I want to close with a few comments on how we think about it. The first is this issue of unilateralism and multilateralism. In my experience, you have this problem of revolutionary groups when you have two criteria that come together. The first is places where governments can't exercise power. And the second is places where there's elements of extremism. In this case, Islamic extremism. Think of every place where you have a significant problem. The Sahel in Africa, Yemen, southern Indonesia, Afghanistan, the border area of Pakistan. They all have two criteria. And so one of the questions I think as a former security professional, and I'm only 49, maybe a future security professional, I better not say anything too off the record or else that job will never happen, is what happens when you get the rise of a group in an ungoverned space and you know that group represents future threat, think Somalia, but you have 9 years of history where a power, that is the United States with its allies, had tremendous credibility 9 years ago and now has less credibility in intervening. How do you match those two together? An interest in intervention to protect and a pulling away of intervention because of the lessons of the last 9 years in Iraq and Afghanistan, because of economic imperatives, and because of a public in the cities like cities I live in that says, we don't want this anymore, we want jobs. The second is how we continue to undercut the message, the revolution, the ideology. I find it humorous that the Al-Qaeda guys say they support the Arab Spring. That is a joke. They hate it. Arab Spring means two things they despise. The first is elections. How can you have an election that might elect someone who doesn't believe that the only true path is the path the Holy Book offers you? You cannot have an election of secularists who might contravene something that the Holy Book says. And secondly, how can you believe in national borders when the goal of the group is the elimination of national borders to create a caliphate like the caliphate was 13 centuries ago? They're 0 for 2. No elections, no national borders. And yet they're out there because they have no option as their ideology declines but to say, we support the will of the people. They do not. They understand, both because of Arab Spring, but primarily because they've lost traction as a result of the killing of innocents, that their ideology is dying. Third issue among four. What do we say when something else happens? And coming from the other side of the Atlantic, my biggest concern is 10 years ago, the adversary owned the battlefield. I sat there at that threat briefing for years, 9 years of threat briefings, of idiots trying to blow themselves up. And initially, the definition of those threat briefings was the unknown for us. We didn't know on Friday night what was going to happen on Saturday. Now we own the turf. Al-Qaeda is dying. Al-Qaeda has died partly in Saudi Arabia. Al-Qaeda has been set back on its heels in Indonesia. The question I have is, we, especially across the Atlantic, without the experience of Ireland, without the experience here of 7/7, we will overreact if there's another event. In the face of a revolutionary movement, what we ought to be saying is sweep up the glass, call them criminals, put them in a court, and say, we don't worry about criminals. We worry about the economy. We worry about childhood diabetes. We're worried about gun violence among gangs. And I'm afraid we're going to give an adversary that's dying ammunition. And the last thing I want to talk about is civil liberties and what expectations are of security services in an environment of globalization, an environment where we have a lot of information about people and where public expectations have given me at least two messages. In an era where you can collect a lot of information about people, ensure that those people never do bad things. And as you ensure they never do bad things, don't violate their civil liberties. Serena Patel, you in here somewhere? Stand up. Serena, you're here. Where are you? Stand up, Serena. Where is she? What? Okay, you're done. Stand up, Serena. This is it. Serena, you're 17 years old, aren't you? When's the last time we met? How about never?
Yeah, never.
That's right. What did you do last night? I think you built a banner for cancer research, didn't you? Is that correct?
Yeah.
Your family is origin Gujarati, is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah.
You were born in a hospital in London, is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. Serena, that's what we call human intelligence. Let me tell you something, Serena, because this is the world you own, not the world I own. Add on, let me look at your Facebook account. I want to see your buddy list on any internet connections you have. I want any ATM transaction you have ever had. I want any Western Union money you ever sent to a family member. I want every phone connection from your cell phone you ever had. I want to watch when you get on any internet site ever. Think of a future, whether it's forget about terrorism, gangs, other criminal activity, human trafficking, when you as citizens tell me as a security professional, make sure bad things don't happen, and I as a security professional, in contrast to the days 17 years ago before Serena was born, when I couldn't access forget about human, I'll buy you a Diet Coke after, it's okay. Forget about human, where I could collect none of that information. I can tell you, sitting at the table, the pressure on people like me was to say, on the one hand they say, don't violate my civil liberties. On the other hand, they say you have access to all this data. Make sure nothing bad ever happens again. And it will. Thank you.
Philip, thank you very much. On the human intelligence side, I was planning to ask you about Saudi Arabia some more, but we'll hold that for the Q&A because there's a lot you can help us understand about that. We've heard, I think, very, very interesting reflections from a Western perspective, what's happening in the Middle East, clearly the struggle against counterterrorism or of counterterrorism. But listening to all this, I have a feeling, Rana, that if we look 10 years ahead and to your field of specialty, which is China, Rana is the Oxford Professor of Modern Chinese History and is Oxford Analytica's region head and oversees our China and Asia analysis. And we're very privileged to have Rana in that role with us. I have a feeling, Rana, that in 10 years, this will all look like a footnote because China's rise and China's dominance, both economically, but also increasingly as an alternative political model for much of the emerging world, is really going to put a lot of this and make it, well, it will pale before the influence of China. Please, your reflections on that.
Many thanks indeed, Nada, and many thanks to all of my distinguished colleagues who have, again, made this a very hard act to follow. When I heard the way in which tonight's discussion and debate was framed, it reminded me of a social event that took place at my own institution, Oxford University, just a few months ago, where a colleague of mine who also works on contemporary Chinese politics was having dinner with a delegation of senior members of the Chinese Communist Party. And one of the members of the dining group asked my friend, what do you think the major problem to face the world in the next 10 years is? He added, I think it's terrorism. And my friend, my colleague, said back to him, well, no, I disagree. I think it's capitalism. Which thereby, I think, confirmed the suspicion of many people, and not just those in the Chinese Communist Party, that Oxford Dons are officially more left-wing than the only major ruling Communist Party anywhere in the world. But the conversation also crystallized something for me that I think was picked up in a very telling metaphor that David Miliband used a little earlier today, which was moving away from the politics of trying to navigate the Panama Canal to the English Channel, to the wide open seas. Because it's very clear to me that the China that has emerged in the 10 years since 9/11, and it is in fact, I think, 2001 that is a very relevant date here, even though not entirely for the same reasons as my colleagues who work on the Middle East have explained. That China has put forward a political model that I think has never been seen anywhere in the world before, although I'd be delighted to get comments and protests from the audience that point out that we have done. But it violates the understanding that most of us have grown up with in the last half century or so in the Cold War situation, where you either had relatively open, relatively liberal democracies, the United States, Western Europe, and so forth, or relatively very closed, inward-looking totalitarian systems, the Berlin Wall being the obvious example in the communist world. And yes, we know, of course, the West supported many regimes that were pretty brutal and pretty authoritarian, and also oriented towards the Soviet side. There were societies like India, which were much more liberal. But broadly speaking, that division between being liberal and open or being totalitarian and closed was a useful rule of thumb for the Cold War era. But what China increasingly seems to have brought about is a society that, not quite like the Mad Hatter, but very close, does two impossible things before breakfast, during breakfast, and during major international summits. And that is to be both open and illiberal. It's clearly illiberal. We know that because there's been a great deal of celebration, rightly, of the fact that two major Chinese dissidents have been let out in the last few days, Hu Jia and Ai Weiwei. On the other hand, a liberal society wouldn't have locked them up in the first place. On the other hand, it's very clear that whatever we think about this society, China, it is not the old Soviet Union. Chinese people travel back and forth from China to the West and the rest of the world on an absolutely regular basis. The largest non-UK group of undergraduates in Oxford University these days is not, as it used to be, the Irish, for obvious reasons of geographical proximity, or Americans, or any Western European nation. It is the Chinese. I have to say this is probably partly because of the current government's cutting of student fees. The Chinese are the only people who can now afford to pay full Oxford fees, but nonetheless, it is a sign of a great demographic change. And in understanding how a society can simultaneously be very open in terms of its engagement with the outside world, but also highly illiberal, we are dealing with a political model that on the one hand has not been seen widely in the world previously, but on the other hand, I suspect, and I will say I fear, is actually going to become a lot commoner in the near future. And there's one other factor that shapes China, but not explicitly and not exclusively China, and that is the kind of nation that is rising in the world and whose understanding of its contemporary role is very much shaped by its historical experience. I am a historian, and therefore it's a natural tick to try and claim that nothing is new. It all happened 75 years ago or 350 years ago, but nonetheless, I think there is some merit to the argument. So I'd like to do that by just briefly touching on 3 places in China, each of which I think tells us something slightly different but significant about the world that is to come. But I will explicitly tie it to what my distinguished colleagues have said this evening about the nature of the world we've just left, the last 10 years. Because I think 9/11 did mark one significant difference in terms of the way in which the Chinese were able to do business. What I've just mentioned, the idea of the growing of an open but illiberal society, I think would have happened anyway because of China's growing economic status and also its increasing desire to take a place in international society. But the other thing that was essentially a sort of additional gift to the Chinese in terms of placing themselves in international society was the aftermath of 9/11, and particularly Western policy in the Middle East. I say this not in terms of making a judgment myself about that policy. Clearly there are many views and they may be debated this evening. But it is, I think, observable that large numbers of societies in the world, including the Chinese, were able to use the way that things turned out in the Middle East to argue that they, and not the liberal West, were where the normal, the central part of international society actually stood. And this created a huge number of ironies. It would have seemed, I think, very unusual 15 or 20 years ago to argue that the Chinese position on human rights, which, as we know, has been very restrictive in many ways on individual liberties, although not as much as under the era of Chairman Mao, could be regarded as a global norm. But unfortunately, that has become much more the case simply because of some of the things, again, for instance, that Philip mentioned earlier, having filtered into the way in which the world perceives the international order. So let's just take briefly the view from Beijing. This is a place which clearly has become a global capital and a center of influence in a way that wouldn't have been the case even 15 or 20 years ago. But it is somewhere that is still finding the way in terms of where it wants to be next. And the example that I think really relates to the last 10 years and to the 10 years to come is an outfit that many people in this room will have heard about, but by no means all, perhaps. The so-called Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Can I take a poll, actually? How many people have ever heard of this outfit? Okay, so a certain number, but not everyone. Perhaps I should pick one of you to ask to explain what it is, or perhaps that would be unwise. We're not in a lecture hall now, at least not at least with my more vulnerable students. One of the ways in which that comes later. One of the ways in which this organization, which was founded just before 9/11 in the spring of 2001, has been characterized by some is an attempt at an alternative NATO. It's basically run with headquarters out of Moscow and Beijing, and with the Chinese-Russian joint leadership, it's also taken on board a whole variety of countries within the Central Asian and South Asian region under its membership. The main problem at the moment, to be absolutely frank, is that every single word in its title is misleading. It's not based in Shanghai, it doesn't cooperate very much, and it's extremely disorganized. But it is an attempt to try and put forward an alternative model of what an international organization might be if Washington or London or NATO were not actually involved in that sort of transnational regional grouping. And even if the SCO itself, and the fact that people haven't heard of it very much is perhaps a sign that it hasn't taken off yet, is not necessarily at the forefront of what will come in the new order, the fact that Beijing is so keen to try this experiment out is a sign that this is not the first, but probably one of many formations that it will attempt to put forward. And that, of course, would enable it to return to the historically informed background of what the historian Josh Fogel has called the Sino Sphere. In other words, the idea of a world which sits within the orbit, not necessarily of China as a country, as a sort of imperially dominant society, but rather people who share perhaps Confucian and other values that culturally link those peoples together, historically including Japan, Vietnam, and large parts of the Southeast Asian world. Clearly, relations between China, Vietnam, and Japan are not exactly rosy at the moment, but then the last 1,000 years have shown a certain number of ups and downs, and the aspiration is clearly there in a new and important way. The second brief place that I'd like to take you is the sunny island of Hainan, down on the south coast of China, a place where one can get up to all sorts of exciting activities with nothing but a cocktail shade to cover over your embarrassment. It's become the place for corrupt Chinese officials of choice to go and spend their ill-gotten fiscal incomings. But it's also become the center for the international conferences that China holds in terms of creating more regional links. Organizations like ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which will take an increasingly important role within the region, are very much being courted by China. Sometimes China manages to annoy them, sometimes China manages to get them involved. But one of the things that China has realized, and its neighbors realize too, is that China is going to be more important in the region and won't go away. And on some of these questions like intervention, like international human rights, it is clear that the voice of the West is being shut out in increasingly noticeable ways, and that we have a lot of work to do if we're going to try and make that previously in the 1990s very universalizing rhetoric have some relevance once again. One has to say the current American administration, I think, has much more traction in that part of the world than the previous one, again, for reasons of ostensible politics rather than necessarily to do with the details of policy. But in most parts of the world, perceptions can become realities. And the final place that I'd like to take you is the southwestern city of Chongqing. How many people here have heard of Chongqing? Most people? Few people. How many people have been to Chongqing? Okay. Well, it was China's old wartime capital. It's got two rivers coming together. It's a very, very exciting place. Not beautiful, but very lively. It's also the biggest city in China. It has 30 million people. So if you haven't heard of it yet, you might want to look it up, because it's going to become increasingly important. I think just before David took over as Foreign Secretary, the UK actually opened a consulate there, which is doing very well. And if you're passing through the consul, I think we're very happy to have some outside company. But it's interesting and important because it is the showcase for the party leader who is quite possibly the future of what the open and illiberal China that I've described is going to be. He's a man called Bo Xilai. He's typical of the new communist elite because he sent his son to Harrow and then on to Balliol College, Oxford, thereby providing the kind of proletarian background which we expect from the Chinese Communist Party. Balliol, very dodgy, I believe, David. All sorts of characters come out of there, it has to be said. But he also made waves last year by using the city's SMS technology to send out Maoist messages to everyone on their mobile phones on the eve of the anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. In other words, this is someone with the communist illiberal outlook, but a very strong viewpoint about how to manipulate public opinion in China. And this is something we have to get used to, the idea that public opinion in an authoritarian society matters. There are an awful lot of people in China on the net, for instance. Actually 310 million, which is, I think, about the same as the population of the United States. Unlike the population of the United States, though, that number is growing by tens of millions every year. These people have strong views about international politics, and those views are generally not liberal. They are now factored in to the way in which Beijing thinks about how it's going to take its foreign policy forward. And if we're not on those blogs, I think Philip mentioned blogs, and it's a very important way of taking the temperature in societies that way, then we're not doing the fullest extent of human intelligence that we can. So understanding the localities, the places where people are trying new things, new ways of engaging, while creating this oxymoronic, paradoxical, illiberal, open society, is where we need to look for the sources of China's next phase of international behavior. China is not yet fully formed in the international community. But as I think it was Michael said, and Nada as well, they see the new world as a world of opportunity. I think it's fair to say that they deserve their chance. I think we should be welcoming China into international society. It's a lot better there than it was when Chairman Mao was trying to launch revolutionary nationalism around the world in the 1960s. But we also have to understand a great deal about what kind of actor it is. And that means that outdated categories, even as a historian I would say this, and ways of understanding the world that worked 10 years ago but don't apply to now need to be discarded, because otherwise we will find that China has come up from behind us and essentially made its view of the world the one that most people pay attention to. And I still think that an alternative view of the world, not incompatible, but congruent with having a responsible China in the international community, is still well within our grasp if we choose to seize it.
Listening to this, I think my friends in the audience know why I'm having such a good time in this job. Thank you, Rana, very much. This has been a fantastic discussion. There's no real, I think, way of thinking about this world to come without understanding Russia, and without understanding, certainly from a European perspective, Russia's interests, Russia's motivations. And I think there's a huge amount of prejudice and a huge amount of cliche around how people interpret Russia, the Russian power games that are going on. And at Oxford Analytica, we are very privileged to have Sarah Michaels as our chief Russia analyst and our deputy director of analysis, who brings a tremendous sense of understanding of the complexity and the interlinkings of politics, security, and economics, very importantly as well, to the analysis of Russia and where Russia is going and what that means, certainly for foreign investors and others looking to understand Russia. And how that will impact them. So, Sarah, please, your thoughts on this.
Thank you very much, Nader, for the gracious introduction. And as Nader hinted at, I'm about to do something which tends to make people, sort of cringe and get very uncomfortable, which is I'm about to say some nice things about Russia, or at least some things about Russia that aren't ridiculously pessimistic. So I just need to throw a couple of disclaimers out there just to get our discussion started. And again, this is a bit awkward for me, but the first is that I used to work for Donald Rumsfeld, like Philip. I'm also a former coffee-drinking bureaucrat. And the second, and again, this is even more embarrassing for me to admit to all of you, is I was born in Texas. And so when you hear me say nice things about Russia, I just want it to be perfectly clear that, nobody here is doing the Kremlin's bidding. I'm not here on behalf of Russia Today or anything like that. And that when you go and you look at where Russia stood in 2001, 10 years ago, and you look at where Russia stands today, a sense of optimism about where Russia is going is not only not ridiculous, but, as I'm going to argue, warranted. Nader mentioned the Russian economy. Well, let's start there. Let's start 10 years ago, when the Russian economy was valued at $306 billion. That's just a little bit larger, and I should say I'm going here on 2010 dollars, adjusted for inflation, all of that. But 10 years ago, the Russian economy was worth just over $300 billion, about the same size as Thailand, about the same size as Venezuela, a little bit smaller than Denmark. The Russian economy today is worth $1.5 trillion, the same size as India. So there's something to be proud of if you're sitting in Moscow. Per capita GDP in 2001 was $2,100, on par with economic powerhouses such as Fiji and El Salvador. Today, it's over $10,000, $10,600, putting Russia very firmly in the category of upper middle income countries and on par with countries such as Brazil and Turkey, about which most of us are quite optimistic. People wonder why Putin has retained popularity for so long. And you look at the dramatic growth of the Russian economy, you look at the fact that per capita GDP grew 5-fold in just 10 years. Wages kept pace with that. And you say, okay, you know what, maybe this really isn't rocket science. Maybe Putin's political acumen isn't so inexplicable. Maybe it really is about prosperity and not some strange cult of personality or something like that. And that's certainly part of the story. But the other thing I want to address is this concept that the story of Russia and the growth of Russia over the last 10 years is really all about oil, or oil and gas. That's part of the story. Rising oil and rising gas prices, in addition to other commodities such as metals, are a necessary condition for the success of the Russian economy. They are not sufficient, and the rise in oil and gas prices from 2001 to 2011 cannot account for the tremendous growth of the Russian economy. Entire sectors that hardly existed in 2001 in terms of consumer services, in terms of financial sector services, in terms of manufacture of foreign automobiles in Russia, the list goes on and on. Entire sectors were just getting on their feet in 2001. And so the growth of the Russian economy, yes, it's a story of oil and gas, but it's also a story of a dramatic rise in labor productivity and in capacity utilization over the last 10 years. Again, relatively short period of time. The really interesting thing, though, and again, remember, 10 years ago, Putin had just come into office. He'd just been in office for about a year and a half, 2 years. The interesting thing is that economic degradation, following the sovereign default and devaluation of the ruble in 1998, that actually wasn't the priority. That wasn't at the top of the agenda. There were more pressing things that Putin had to worry about. And this explains why, when we go back 10 years, Russia looks quite insular. It looks quite focused on itself. When we think about the tremendous security risks and risks to not just the capacity, but the integrity of the Russian state that we were dealing with 10 years ago, the picture looks even more dramatic. I'm talking here about Chechnya. I'm talking here about the war which 10 years ago was grinding on and looked like there was no end in sight. And there seemed to be a very real risk of secession, of the establishment of a caliphate along Russia's southern border. I'm talking also about so-called loose nukes and the security, or rather the insecurity, of Russia's nuclear arsenal. I'm talking about even a good old-fashioned military coup, which, you know, you go back 10 years and you look at respected Western academic articles and you look at Russian Academy of Sciences publications and things like that, and this is what people were talking about. This is what people were worrying about in Russia 10 years ago, and this is what Russia watchers, such as myself, were worrying about. Even aside from security issues, the big question about Russia 10 years ago was whether it was going to succumb to an HIV/AIDS epidemic of sub-Saharan African proportions, or possibly even worse. So when we think about where Russia is today compared to where it was 10 years ago, I mean, look, we all know the horror stories. And again, we all know the nightmare stories of businesses that have had terrible times in Russia. But it also makes sense to keep in mind how many bullets, how many disasters Russia has dodged. And let's be frank here, not all of these were because of prudent policy. Some of them were simply because of blind luck. But as we think about where Russia is going, let's try, again, not to be too pessimistic, but not to be too optimistic either, and to keep a balanced view of where Russia stands today and where Russia will be in 2021. So there are a few signposts that I'd like to throw out there for further discussion about where Russia is going. A few things that we should look out for, because the fallacy of trendline analysis is to assume that just because Russia has succeeded in economic terms so extraordinarily in the last 10 years, it's going to continue on that trajectory, that things are going to remain as they are. Well, that's not the case. We know that's not the case. So what are the things we need to look out for in terms of where Russia is going? Well, I'll start with a fake signpost, and then I'll start with a screamingly, and then I'll go into a screamingly obvious one that nonetheless needs to be noted. And then I'd like to highlight 3 things that might not necessarily be on the radar screen, but nonetheless offer very interesting insights into how the Russian authorities see their country's development trajectory. But let's tackle this fake signpost first. And the fake signpost is the Putin versus Medvedev question. And which one of them is going to be sitting in the Kremlin after the March 2012 presidential election? It just doesn't matter that much. Which isn't to say that the question is irrelevant. But it is to say, you know, and this is an old joke now, the joke is that there's a Medvedev team and there's a Putin team, and Medvedev's on the Putin team. That there just isn't that much distance between the two of them, certainly not enough to alter Russia's development trajectory over the next 10 years. So let's dispense with that. On to the screamingly obvious but still noteworthy signpost is, of course, oil and gas prices. As I said, rising or at least steady plateau of oil and gas prices are absolutely essential to the continued success of the Russian economy. There's every reason to be skeptical about Medvedev's modernization agenda and about his ability to diversify the economy away from natural resources and particularly away from oil and gas. So obviously, you know, let's be honest, if the oil price collapses, which admittedly looks very unlikely right now, but if the oil price collapses, the Russians are perfectly screwed. This is why there were such incredibly anxious statements coming out of Moscow when it was announced last week that strategic reserves of oil would be released. They freaked. They absolutely freaked because, again, the idea of an oil price collapse is something that is inimical to continued Russian growth, and the Russian authorities are aware of that. But let's move on to the 3 signposts that, again, might not be quite as obvious. The first is an experiment in governance, and I'm going to come back to the North Caucasus here, an experiment in governance that's being conducted in the Russian Republic of Ingushetia, which is right next door to Chechnya, which, again, is stable, but certainly far from pluralistic and certainly far from where many of us would like it to be. There is an experiment in governance going on in Ingushetia in terms of trying to make that regional government a little bit more pluralistic, trying to make it a little bit more open to the traditional societal structures that have existed there for hundreds, if not thousands, of years. It's too early to tell whether this is going to be a success. The president of Ingushetia, who has just been in office for a couple of years, has made some very powerful enemies and nearly gotten himself killed, quite literally. But if we look at where the North Caucasus, which is, of course, Russia's Achilles heel, if we look at where that's going, we need to keep an eye on the Ingushetia experiment to get a sense of where Russia sees the North Caucasus evolving and whether it can manage the extraordinary ethnic and sectarian problems that persist in that part of the country. The second thing we need to keep an eye on is pensions. Russia has got a serious pensions crisis building, and that may actually come to a head in the not too distant future, like maybe 4 or 5 years down the road. We look at Russia's sovereign debt position today and it looks fantastic. Sovereign debt is minimal. But we look at the size of the Russian pension fund, which is also minimal. And then we look at demographic trends, such as the fact that while life expectancy for Russian men is still abysmally low, that's not the case for Russian women. And the average Russian woman lives long enough now to receive a pension for 19 years. It becomes clear that that system is unsustainable and that that is not only a key fiscal risk, but that that is hugely politically sensitive and therefore something that's not going to be tackled. They're going to kick that can down the road as long as they possibly can. The third signpost in terms of where Russia is going actually isn't in Russia. It's just slightly to the west in Ukraine. Russia certainly has a proprietary strategy, a proprietary attitude, if you will, towards what it likes to think of as the near abroad, what it likes to think of as its satellite states, if you will. Crunch time is coming up for the Russia-Ukraine relationship. The president of Ukraine has proven that he is not going to subordinate Ukraine's interest to Moscow. And indeed, we're looking within the next couple of years at the possibility of an association agreement and a deep free trade agreement between Ukraine and the EU. We're also seeing Ukraine selling some very sophisticated weapons technologies to China, technologies that Russia has not wanted to sell because it regards China as a security threat, about which more in a moment, if you'd like. So how Russia reacts to that, how Russia deals with Ukraine, its most important former Soviet occasional ally, strategic partner, to use the terminology that's favored in Moscow, is an important indication not just of that relationship, but of how Russia is going to deal with, again, what it calls the near abroad, and whether it can transition away from some of the proprietary relationships, let's say, that it has had, or at least that it has sought to have, with those states over the last 10 years. Just to conclude, I would like to caution against a couple of tropes. It's so easy to fall back into the Cold War thinking that Russia is both incredibly powerful and about to take over the world, and at the same time is incredibly weak and about to collapse. Those understandings didn't serve us particularly well during the Cold War, and they're not serving us any better now. So again, just to conclude, I would say that what is needed here is to look at Russia with a cautious and with an objective eye, and with a sense that castigating Russia on moral or other normative grounds not only does Russia a disservice, but it does us a disservice. We do a disservice to ourselves in not being able to take that step back and look at where Russia was, where it is now, and where it is going in the next 10 years. Thank you.
Sarah, thank you very much. I know we have had a very interesting exchange, but I would love to take questions from the audience on any and all subjects. Sir, in the back there. Please do try to make your questions short so we leave time for others as well.
Just a short question. You're under something that says join the debate on Twitter. That wouldn't have been around 10 years ago either. I'm just wondering how much you're talking about the influence of the internet, global communications, possibly with a benefit in the Arab Spring. But really it's a question for Professor Mitter to say, well, you talk about the thesis of illiberalism but open. Why is there not an inexorable drive towards liberalism through the power of the internet, which maybe we're seeing elsewhere, which maybe also contributed to the open seas upon which we find ourselves?
Great question. Why don't we take a couple more on it, if you would. Okay, a couple more questions. There, please. The gentleman with a comment, now a question.
Thank you very much. Aminullah Habibi, a research fellow at the Defense Academy, and I'm an Afghan as well. I have a comment rather than a question, and that is coming to Mr. Miliband's talk mainly. You know, the disorder that we see in the past decade, but we do not see the necessary institutional adjustment in the West to deal with those disorders. There are lots of problems, Afghanistan and other places, but still we do not have that necessary adjustments to deal with those. When you were Foreign Secretary, and also before when Jack Straw was the Foreign Secretary, numerous comments came that in Afghanistan we need a system that incorporates Sharia law in it, or a Sharia-based system in Afghanistan. And I just wanted to be there to say that, well, could you please hang on a minute? You know, we have had a lot of that. Could you, get some advice from an Afghan? I don't know if I could ask this question from you. Did you have any Afghan expert with you that, to ask their opinion and then make your comments on Afghanistan? Because any Western leader that make a comment, I know from Afghanistan what does that mean in Afghanistan in that context. And I think if in order to deal with these disorderliness, we need some institutional adjustment and leave that empire type of mentality that we had in the past, that we design a policy here and then we implement it there. That wouldn't work. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's take two more questions, please. There, please. Right here in the front.
Thank you. My question, I think, is for Philip. You said that we don't need to tackle a group, rather we need to blunt an instrument. But I'm a little bit wary of the fact that revolutionaries have a lot of energy. So if you blunt that instrument, where's it going to go?
Thank you. One more question. Someone's waving vigorously there. Okay, there you go.
This question is really for the whole panel. And I was wondering, one thing we haven't discussed, or that hasn't been discussed so far this evening, was the role of the melting ice in the Arctic Circle and the threat of land grabbing for resources by the nations surrounding the Arctic Circle, and what the panel's views were on that.
Okay, thank you. Why don't we take them in order? Rana, would you start?
Yep.
On the...
Very good question from the gentleman at the back. The reason that the technological boom in China, in terms of internet, the equivalent of Twitter, which is called Sino Weibo, and so forth, have not led to greater liberalism, is because historically, communications technology has been just as usable by anti-liberal governments, regimes, movements, as it has by liberal ones. The liberalism has to come from the fabric of the society underneath. And historically, one of the reasons in the last century and a half why China has not had that liberal moment is that it's suffered a succession of wars, invasion, and all sorts of other historical circumstances that prevent the freedom of space that allows that liberalism to emerge. You could argue that it's really been at war in one sense or another all the way through the 20th century up until perhaps the 1980s, which is a very recent time. However, there's no reason culturally why the fabric isn't there. And the really good example of that, of course, is the example of Taiwan, culturally an entirely Chinese society, which has developed from dictatorship to a liberal democracy. So it's not impossible, but history needs to come together with technology to make it happen.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask the panel to answer quickly as well so we can come back out. David.
Very briefly, yes, there's big institutional adjustment that needs to be done in the West, and you're right that although Afghanistan is called the graveyard of empires, it's actually, we've got to think in a much more post-imperial sort of way. I think you were also asking, do we have sufficient Afghan voices in our ministries and elsewhere? I mean, one should never give oneself an A+. We worked very, very hard to make sure that we were creating processes that were Afghan-led. But did we do a good enough job? You can never say it was good enough, but we tried to be conscious of history as well as the present. And in my 6 trips to Afghanistan, I tried to work very hard, not just to get the official view, either from the British military and British officialdom, or from Afghan officialdom as well. And I think that that's going to be one of the things I learned and came through very, very strongly, is this point that the balance of power that's going to hold the ring in Afghanistan is going to be a series of local political settlements. And until one understands the 40,000 villages and valleys, until one understands the weave of that society, then one's not going to be able to play a constructive role at all. And I think that's the disjunction that the West has been struggling with for a long time.
Philip, revolution.
On revolution, I think it's worth remembering, I'll answer your question in just a second, but the distinction between what al-Qaeda was trying to do and what they could do. And that is, they're trying to tap a revolutionary spirit, and I'm not sure that existed. Even at the start, I think there was a distinction between people who didn't like the West and people who supported this concept of revolution. So I think they're a fringe group in a sense. But to your point, I think it gets to the core of what we've faced in the past couple decades, in particular in the past few months on Arab Spring and on people power. We in the West have talked about the voice of the people, but favored security. And in my world, from a Washington perspective, think Philippines, think Haiti, now think Egypt, think elsewhere in North Africa, think the sheikdoms in the Gulf. We are struggling when we get people power, think Hezbollah in Lebanon, and think Hamas in Gaza, to allow the people to speak in ways that make us uncomfortable. And so I think the answer to your question is people have avenues that will continue to make the al-Qaeda revolution die, but we in the West have to understand that democracy doesn't mean stability, and it doesn't mean that the people who win reflect the worldview that we share. So make the choice. You want people to have a voice which will lead to stability, and that voice will make you incredibly uncomfortable. I think I know what the choice is. You live by the sword, you die by the sword. That is, you like the voice of the people, you accept it. You talk to Hezbollah and you talk to Hamas. Okay, I'll never get a job in government. But I think there is an outlet for voices as long as we accept the implications, and that is going to be very difficult. And I think more difficult as people find a voice because of the echoes of the Arab Spring. Wait a minute, I didn't say that was a good thing.
I think the last question was really about climate change. Was that sorry, I apologize, but sorry. the question you asked.
Sorry, the question I asked was about the potential for grabbing natural resources around the Arctic Circle as the ice caps melt and the...
Oh, I see. Okay, sorry about that. I heard the Arctic Circle. I thought melting ice caps. Sarah, do you want to have a go at that?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a very important question, but one that also gets to the heart of why multinational governance of the Arctic is going to be incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to achieve. The short answer is that Russia is absolutely thrilled about the melting of the ice caps in terms of the natural resource opportunities that opens up, in terms of the possibilities of shipping not just gas, but metals from far northern ports to China, which is just getting off the ground. But again, the projections over the long term are that will become a viable shipping route.
Okay, we don't want to take away your evening completely, so let's take a few more questions here at the end. Please, in the middle of the room there. Please make them brief, and we'll try to be brief at this end too.
Okay,
please.
I'll keep it short. So my question's really to David and Philip, but more to David. So I too have a younger brother, and he can be equally as annoying. And one of the things he really gets annoyed at me about is unfairness, when I treat something unfairly. And you talked about the traumatic decade for the West and possibly the opposing glorious decade for the East. And my question is that if we have to change the way in which Western governments deal with Arabic and Eastern governments, it's purely because of the voice of the people is being heard more and more via the Arab Spring, doesn't that say a lot about the category of people we were dealing with before? And don't you think that hypocrisy is a cause for anger in the Arab world?
Okay, another question, please. Yes, please.
Specifically regarding China, I've been finding that with the portrayal of President Hu and Premier Wen in the media, it seems as if they're being lauded as quite a lot more liberal than perhaps, obviously, Chairman Mao. I wondered that regarding your comments as the balance of illiberalism and openness, would you see them as generally more followers of Mao and the Maoist regime, or more pragmatists like Deng and Zhou Enlai?
Okay, one more question, please. There in the aisle there, or in the middle there.
This is to Philip. As you have just returned from Saudi Arabia, what extent is the United States promoting democracy in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia?
Okay, I think why don't we end there. Philip, do you want to start with the last question?
Not so much. I'm not going to answer your question directly, but I hope you'll understand it's not because I'm dodging. I don't believe in the Arab Spring. This is entirely misleading. There is an uprising among people who oppose presidents for life, who lack legitimacy, and who lack economic power to give people jobs. Okay, give me two characteristics that you don't find in most Gulf sheikdoms, and Bahrain has some special issues because of a Shia majority. That is, governments that, we don't like to say this in the West, that have some legitimacy. I live in Saudi Arabia, people like the king, and that have the economic capability to make people happy. So, you know, I'm not here to argue that the U.S. or most countries around the world support democracy in Saudi Arabia. But let's be clear about not putting sheikdoms that, whether or not we like it in the West, have some legitimacy among the people and who do not have the economic disadvantages of Egypt and Tunisia, and trying to oust Hosni Mubarak, who lacks legitimacy as a president for life, he's not a tribal leader, and who lacks economic capability to give people jobs or, better yet, food.
Thank you. Rana.
In a sense, that answer picks up very well to answer the question about China. I think it would be very dangerous to underestimate the level of legitimacy that the Chinese Communist Party has with its population, even though A, it doesn't hold general elections, and B, it shows this sort of paranoid fear, not least when the so-called Arab Spring actually emerged. They started stopping anyone on the internet searching for the word jasmine. There are no Maoists, or very few Maoists, certainly at high levels, in the classic sense of wanting to go back to a command economy, a cultural revolution, murdering 1 million landlords in the fields with sticks to destroy class hierarchies. That sort of Maoism was gone a very long time ago and is never coming back. What there is an increasing concern about the lack of a human face to some of the turbo-capitalism in China. Yes, people are getting richer, and more people are richer than they were, but the inequality levels in China are also getting much greater. It has the highest Gini coefficient, the economists' measure of economic inequality, one of the highest Gini coefficients of any large country in the world. And much of the Maoist rhetoric, such as the one used by my example, Bo Xilai in Qingqing, is actually meant to be a way of putting forward a populist politics, even with elections. One sentence that someone said about this, which I think is lovely, is that the Chinese Communist Party acts as if it's continuously running for election. It just never holds a ballot.
David will take this question, and I think we will have a couple of others. But David, do you want to just answer the question about how we treat the Arab leaders?
Well, remember your Weber. Weber said that legitimacy can come from history, revolutionary history, nation-building history. It can come from charisma, and it can come from the democratic mandate. And what happened in Egypt was a legitimacy crisis of a very fundamental kind, because there was no legitimate authority. And I think the bar for the exercise of authority in a legitimate way has been raised. You can call it the Arab Spring or not, but in undemocratic countries, the bar for the exercise of legitimate authority has been raised. The consent of the people and the accountability of power is going to be demanded in a more significant way than before. That's not to say that every country is going to become a liberal democracy overnight or even within the next 10 years. And I think that Philip's point, the monarchy, fundamentally the monarchies of the Middle East are in a different position than the autocracies than the republics of the Middle East, for starters, because royal lineage gives you some legitimacy in the eyes of many people. It's the route to a constitutional monarchy, after all, in some countries, and you may see that developing in Morocco. But the other sources of legitimacy, in terms of the accountability of power, in terms of it's interesting to think about the charisma of Premier Wen. If you see him electioneering in China, which is essentially what he's doing it in a very effective way. I just want to pick up your hypocrisy word, which I think is very, very important. No one on the streets of Tahrir Square was burning Israeli flags or really talking about the Arab-Israeli conflict. But the prism through which Western intentions, actions, good faith is seen is significantly that issue. And it's significantly that issue, I think, I've reflected on this, I think it's because it's such a soluble problem that our inability collectively as an international community to solve it is ascribed as must be being because of bad faith. And I think that that is a very important underlying issue when it comes to the protestations that we make about the role that we want the West to play in the world and the sort of inclusive globalization that we believe in. Now, the hypocrisy plays through in a range of other areas, the vested interests that we sometimes do and sometimes are alleged to defend, the moral standards that we uphold. And I think that in that context, the most dangerous hypocrisy is the one that sees us allied with people who the people of a country don't want. And in a way, it wasn't that we corroded Mubarak's authority, he corroded our authority. And I think that happened with General Musharraf as well in Pakistan. It'd be interesting to have the debate that you've got here in a few months' time with him. But essentially, we ended up undermining ourselves, and that's the most dangerous thing you can do in politics.
Okay, we will take, thank you, two last questions. There in the far back there.
Hi, I would just like to ask about the role of Africa in the world remade, as it's something that's not been touched upon, specifically relating to maybe the idea of exporting the illiberal, open Chinese model and what their role will be in Africa in the next decade.
Africa.
Okay, and one here in the front. So China and Africa. China and Africa.
I wanted to ask the panel about Pakistan. 9/11 had tremendous consequences for that country. What do you see happening to that country in the next 10 years?
Okay. Rana, a little bit from you. I can talk
Could I just
about
have the mic was a bit fuzzy. Could I have the question
the
in one
role
sentence?
of China and Africa, right, and how they see it and perhaps how it will change Africa.
China's role in Africa is not, as some people have characterized it as being some sort of master plan that's being set up from Beijing. Both sides are finding their way and making a lot of mistakes along the way as well. The thing to realize is that there's no such thing as a China model. There's not one blueprint that's being placed in countries in Africa or even in Latin America, where they also have influence as well. Instead, there's, what if you want to be slightly kind of playful, is a sort of China vibe. The kind of ideas that I put forward, and which David Miliband mentioned earlier about control of territorial sovereignty, but also the idea of showing through a variety of things such as foreign aid and so forth, that there are different ways of putting input into a society. Because China is seen as relatively low-key and non-interfering in local politics, for the most part, it has so far managed to find a way to actually help to do some of the things that Sarah mentioned, like extracting mineral resources from these countries. But it's running up against one big problem, and that will continue to be a problem. And that's the fact that, unlike 30 years ago during the Cold War, many African countries are now democracies, and many of their electorates are not keen on the Chinese involvement. So if you want to see where the friction's going to come in the next 10 years, I would look at the general elections in African countries like Zambia, Malawi, and so forth. I think that's where the friction will come.
Michael, would you take the Pakistan question?
Yeah, I was in Pakistan up until 6 weeks before 9/11, so of course I've watched over the last so many years the effect of, the corrosive effect, if you like, of 9/11 and the war in Afghanistan on Pakistan. And the thing that worries me most, I think, is the position of the army, which has always been the spinal column, if you like, of the country. And what we've seen in the last few weeks of the Army Chief of Staff having to go around barracks and basically try and reassure everybody that you know, the army is still in the right place, I think that's a very worrying development. And that was because Osama bin Laden, who launched 9/11, was found not in the tribal areas, but in Abbottabad, Pakistani equivalent of Camberley, about as, you know, as full of army installations as you can imagine. And then the US come in, special forces come in and deal with Osama bin Laden, and the Pakistanis do nothing. Now, I can understand why that is a traumatic effect, traumatic event, but at the same time, I have to ask myself, how is it that the Pakistani establishment has got itself into the position where UBL is so closely, is resident so close up against the army? And how is it that the army themselves don't seem to recognize the existential threat of Pakistani Taliban and religious extremism in the country? And why is it that they keep on blaming outsiders? So I really do worry about the deteriorating situation, and I think the failure of the establishment in Pakistan to deal with a whole host of issues that are now pressing right up against Islamabad. This is no longer, you know, a distant threat. This is right there. And of course, now they turn back to China. It's very interesting. But I think the situation is going seriously downhill.
David, a closing thought from you on Pakistan.
Well, I think that the fundamental problem is that the state capacity to deal with its problems is just completely out of kilter with the scale of the problems. I mean, this is a country with 30 years of military rule over the last 60 years, borders still contested, massive illiteracy. You know, 3% of girls in the FATA know how to read and write, chronic poverty, massive demographic growth, and then thrown on top of that, they've got internal terrorism, floods, droughts, wars, you name it. And it would be taxing for the most efficient government in the world, and they haven't got the most efficient government in the world. I think that, so in terms of the prospects are at the moment pretty bleak. But they are not inevitably going to go wrong, I would say, further wrong, because I have seen a big change in Pakistan in the last 3 years. And the big change is that more and more Pakistanis know in their guts that their problems are internal, not Indian. That more and more Pakistanis that you speak to will admit that the big problem the country faces is not from its traditional foe and neighbor, its problems are internal. Now, the question is whether the multiplication of the problems, including the fact that Pakistan is going to be the fourth, I think, most populous country in the world by 2050, whether the multiplication of the problems overwhelms them. What will decide that, in the end, is the way the international community engages. It's very significant, the Chinese engagement now in Pakistan, re-engagement. But one of the most worrying things I've heard in the last 3 or 4 months, I was in Washington in April, at the end of April, just before the bin Laden killing, was serious debate among serious people about whether or not the US should disengage from Pakistan. Disengage not just militarily, but financially and in other ways. And I think that would be very dangerous. I've argued for a long time for a rebalancing of the US engagement with Pakistan, which has been far too much about the military and far too little about the development of the institutions and economy of that country. But I think we've got a real argument about the way to go forward, and I think the European Union has got quite a big role in that.
Great. Well, thank you very much, all of you, for joining us this evening. Our friends at Intelligence² have allowed me, in closing, to make one last point, which is that the kind of conversation that you've heard this evening, we are going to have at Oxford Analytica's annual conference in September, which will take place in Oxford from the 14th to the 16th. We're going to have a range of speakers from Kofi Annan to Bob Rubin to David Miliband and others here on the panel there to discuss global issues. I very much hope you enjoyed this discussion this evening. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you.